The valley looked quiet at first. That was the terrifying part. In the early morning haze, British cavalry officers stared ahead at what seemed like a distant line of Russian guns sitting silently at the far end of a long, open corridor surrounded by hills. Then, someone finally realized the truth. The artillery was not only waiting in front of them, it was hidden on both sides of the valley as well. Within minutes, hundreds of mounted soldiers would ride directly into one of the most disastrous military blunders of the 19th century. And many of them would not fully understand why they had been sent there in the first place. What happened during the charge of the Light Brigade has often been remembered as a story of courage and heroism, but the reality inside that valley was far more chaotic, confused, and terrifying than the legend most people know today. And the deeper you look into the story, the more it begins to feel less like a glorious cavalry attack and more like the moment an entire style of warfare shattered in front of the modern world. If you enjoy dark military history and stories that reveal what war really felt like from the inside, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments what historical event you think was more chaotic than history usually tells us. Because today we are going into the valley itself, October 25th, 1854. The Crimean War had already become a grinding and miserable conflict, fought on muddy hills, cold camps, and smoke-covered battlefields near the Black Sea. British soldiers had arrived, expecting a quick campaign filled with honor and prestige. Instead, they found disease, exhaustion, freezing rain, and commanders who often struggled to communicate even the simplest orders clearly. Yet despite all of this, one thing still remained untouched in the minds of many officers: the belief that cavalry charges could still decide battles through speed, discipline, and raw courage. The Light Brigade represented that belief perfectly. They were not ordinary troops. These were elite British cavalrymen mounted on fast horses, dressed in striking uniforms, and trained to move with precision under fire. To much of Europe, they symbolized the pride of the British Empire itself. Young aristocrats filled their officer ranks, and many still viewed war through the lens of glory and tradition. But the battlefield waiting ahead of them was no longer the battlefield of Napoleon. Cannons had become deadlier. Rifled weapons could reach farther than ever before. Smoke covered entire valleys, and confusion spread faster than commands. The old world of heroic charges was beginning to collide with the brutal realities of industrial-age warfare. That morning near the town of Balaclava, Russian forces had already captured several Ottoman defensive positions along the hills surrounding the British camp. From higher ground, British commanders watched enemy troops dragging away captured artillery pieces. Angry discussions broke out among the officers observing the battlefield from a distant ridge. Orders were shouted. Messengers rode back and forth across muddy terrain. But somewhere between those hurried commands and the men waiting below in the valley, something went terribly wrong. A single misunderstood order would soon send nearly 700 cavalrymen directly into the heart of concentrated Russian fire. And once the brigade began moving forward, there would be no stopping what came next. Long before the first cannon fired into the valley, the men of the Light Brigade had already been shaped by a completely different world. Many of them came from a military culture that still believed war could be elegant. Officers arrived from wealthy, aristocratic families, carrying reputations, traditions, and pride that stretched back generations. To them, cavalry was not simply another branch of the army. It was prestige. It was speed, discipline, and honor, wrapped together beneath polished sabers and brightly colored uniforms. Even the horses themselves were treated almost like extensions of the men who rode them. Every movement was drilled repeatedly until rider and animal moved as one. In Britain, cavalry officers were admired figures, celebrated in newspapers and paintings as symbols of confidence and imperial power. But the battlefield waiting in Crimea did not care about old ideas of glory. By 1854, war was changing faster than many commanders understood. New artillery could strike from farther away with devastating precision. Rifled muskets had transformed infantry firepower. Smoke from gunpowder drifted across entire battlefields, turning communication into confusion within minutes. Yet many senior officers still imagined combat through the traditions of an earlier age, where courage and momentum could overcome almost anything. The Light Brigade existed in the middle of this dangerous transition between old warfare and modern destruction. Some soldiers sensed it already. Veterans who had seen recent combat knew how quickly cavalry charges could collapse under concentrated artillery fire. But questioning orders was almost unthinkable inside the rigid culture of the British Army. Discipline mattered more than doubt. Obedience mattered more than survival. And above them stood commanders whose personal rivalries made the situation even worse. Lieutenant General Lord Lucan and Major General Lord Cardigan, two of the senior cavalry leaders involved that day, despised each other on a personal level. They barely communicated except when absolutely necessary. Officers beneath them understood the tension and often found themselves trapped between conflicting personalities and unclear instructions. Even Lord Raglan, the overall British commander observing the battlefield from higher ground, struggled to fully understand what his cavalry officers below could actually see from inside the valley. From Raglan's elevated position, Russian troops appeared exposed while moving captured guns away from the hills. To him, the solution seemed obvious. The cavalry should advance quickly and stop the Russians from removing the artillery. But the geography below told a completely different story. The valley stretched nearly a mile long, flanked by Russian guns positioned along the ridges to both the left and right. Thick smoke drifted across the battlefield. Visibility shifted constantly. What looked clear from one position became confusing from another. Somewhere in this growing confusion, orders began passing from one officer to another. Riders galloped through mud carrying handwritten instructions across uneven ground, while artillery thundered in the distance. Every delay increased tension. Every repeated message lost clarity. Men waited beside their horses, trying to understand what exactly was happening ahead. Some believed they were preparing for a limited maneuver. Others suspected a larger assault was coming. But almost nobody expected they were about to ride directly into the center of a heavily defended Russian position. Then the final order arrived. Officers read it quickly, faces tightened. One commander reportedly asked in disbelief whether the attack was truly intended. The answer came back cold and direct. The cavalry was to advance immediately. And within moments, hundreds of mounted soldiers began forming lines at the edge of the valley, while Russian artillery crews prepared their guns in silence ahead. The valley had become unnaturally quiet. Hundreds of cavalrymen sat mounted in long, straight lines, while cold wind drifted across the hills and carried the distant echo of artillery from other parts of the battlefield. Some men adjusted their gloves against the morning chill. Others checked straps and reins with trembling hands, pretending not to notice the Russian guns staring down at them from the ridges ahead. Horses snorted nervously, sensing the tension spreading through the ranks. Officers moved back and forth, speaking in low voices, but confusion was everywhere now. Nobody seemed fully certain what the real objective was. Some believed they were supposed to recover captured artillery from nearby hills. Others assumed the Russians were retreating. But when soldiers looked directly ahead into the valley itself, what they saw made little sense. The ground sloped gently downward for nearly a mile toward a heavily defended Russian position. Artillery batteries sat at the far end. Additional guns lined both sides of the valley behind elevated ridges. It looked less like an attack route and more like a corridor built specifically to trap anyone reckless enough to ride through it. Captain Louis Nolan, one of the officers responsible for carrying the order, had already grown visibly frustrated during the exchanges between commanders. He understood cavalry doctrine better than most around him and reportedly believed hesitation would only worsen the situation. Yet even he seemed unable to fully explain what the higher command truly intended. Lord Lucan stared ahead uneasily. He recognized the danger immediately. The valley offered almost no cover. The Russians had commanding positions on all sides. But the order had arrived directly from Lord Raglan, and refusing it would mean openly defying the commander of the British forces in the middle of battle. Pride, hierarchy, and confusion now mixed together into something far more dangerous than enemy fire. Nearby, soldiers of a Light Brigade waited with growing dread. Many were experienced riders, but few had ever seen a battlefield laid out so clearly against them. One cavalryman would later describe the moment as feeling like they had already crossed an invisible line before even moving forward. Another remembered watching officers whisper to each other with expressions that seemed uncertain rather than confident. Still, discipline held the formation together. No one broke ranks, no one turned away, because this was the culture they had been raised inside. British cavalry officers were expected to lead from the front, regardless of the odds. Retreat without orders was shameful. Hesitation was weakness. And so the brigade prepared to move, while many already suspected the attack made little tactical sense. Then came the command to advance. At first, the movement was slow and controlled. Horses stepped forward together as sabers reflected faint light beneath heavy clouds drifting over the valley. The sound was almost strangely calm. Thousands of hooves pressed into damp earth in steady rhythm, while the long formation descended toward the open ground below. Russian artillery crews watched silently from the distance. Some British soldiers later recalled seeing enemy gunners standing motionless beside their cannons, as if waiting for confirmation that the attack was truly happening. For several moments, almost nothing interrupted the silence except the growing thunder of cavalry moving downhill. Then the first artillery rounds finally screamed across the valley. Dirt erupted beside the advancing formation. Horses jerked violently. The illusion of control shattered instantly. Within seconds, the valley transformed from tense silence into confusion, filled with smoke, noise, and panicked movement. Officers shouted commands barely audible above the explosions, while cavalrymen struggled to maintain formation through drifting clouds of dust and gunpowder. And still, the brigade kept riding forward, deeper into the valley, toward the Russian guns waiting at the far end. The moment the artillery opened fire, time itself seemed to distort inside the valley. What had begun as a disciplined cavalry advance now dissolved into fragments of smoke, noise, and scattered movement. British riders struggled to keep formation as cannon fire crashed across the open ground from multiple directions. Horses swerved in panic. Officers shouted commands that disappeared beneath the thunder rolling between the hills. Visibility dropped almost immediately as clouds of dirt and gray smoke drifted through the advancing lines. Some cavalrymen later admitted they could no longer even tell where their own units were positioned. All they knew was that they had to keep moving forward. Captain Nolan rode near the front during the opening moments of the advance, still attempting to direct movement while frustration and urgency spread through the command structure. Then suddenly, he vanished from the charge entirely, becoming one of the earliest officers lost in the confusion. His death only deepened the chaos already swallowing the brigade. Whatever clarity still remained in the chain of command disappeared with him. From that point forward, many cavalrymen relied entirely on instinct and momentum. The valley itself had become a machine of confusion. Russian artillery crews along the ridges adjusted their aim repeatedly as the British formation advanced deeper into the open corridor. Every few seconds, another explosion tore through the smoke ahead or behind. Riders became separated from their regiments without realizing it. Horses without riders raced wildly through the drifting haze. Some men continued forward simply because stopping felt even more dangerous. Others lowered their heads against the storm of dust and smoke, barely able to see more than a few yards ahead. Yet despite the collapsing order around them, the brigade did not break completely. That was perhaps the most astonishing part of the entire disaster. Even while surrounded by confusion, fear, and constant artillery fire, many cavalrymen continued riding in remarkably straight lines toward the distant Russian batteries. The discipline drilled into them over years of training held together longer than logic should have allowed. Officers waved sabers through the smoke, trying to rally scattered groups. Trumpets sounded commands almost nobody could hear clearly anymore. Men shouted to one another through the haze, but voices vanished beneath the roar echoing across the valley walls. One British soldier later described the scene as riding through a thunderstorm made entirely of smoke and iron. Another remembered the horrifying feeling of seeing the valley grow narrower as they advanced deeper toward the guns. There was no longer any illusion of tactical purpose. The attack had transformed into pure survival. Yet turning back seemed impossible. The Russians controlled the heights behind them now as well. Cavalrymen understood instinctively that retreating through the same corridor under artillery fire might become even worse than continuing forward, so the brigade kept moving. Closer and closer to the Russian artillery line waiting at the far end of the valley. Through gaps in the smoke, soldiers could finally see the enemy batteries clearly now. Russian gunners worked frantically around their cannons, while infantry units gathered nearby to protect the position. The British cavalry had somehow crossed nearly the entire valley despite the devastating confusion surrounding them. But the closer they came to the Russian guns, the stranger the entire battlefield felt. Horses slipped across torn ground. Riders emerged from the smoke alone, separated from their regiments and unsure who still remained alive beside them. The charge no longer resembled an organized military maneuver. It looked like fragments of an army, still moving forward through sheer momentum, even after the original plan had completely collapsed. And somehow, against all logic, some of them were actually about to reach the guns. By the time the surviving cavalrymen reached the Russian artillery line, the charge no longer felt real to many of them. The valley behind them had disappeared beneath drifting smoke and dust, while shattered formations emerged from the haze in scattered clusters rather than organized regiments. Horses stumbled across torn ground, slick with mud and debris. Riders who had begun the advance beside lifelong friends now found themselves surrounded by strangers from different units, all moving forward with the same stunned expression. Yet, somehow, the momentum carried them all the way to the enemy guns. Then suddenly, the distance collapsed. Russian artillery crews appeared directly ahead through the smoke, working frantically beside their cannons as the British cavalry closed the final yards at full speed. For one brief moment, the battlefield transformed from long-range bombardment into close confusion. Sabers flashed through the haze. Horses crashed between artillery positions. Men shouted in multiple languages, while smoke rolled across the valley floor so thickly that some soldiers later admitted they could barely see more than shapes moving beside them. The attack had finally reached its target, but almost immediately, another horrifying truth became obvious. There was no real plan for what happened after this point. The brigade had managed to break into the artillery line, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and completely unsupported. British cavalrymen looked around, expecting reinforcements that never came. Behind them stretched the same deadly valley they had just crossed, still dominated by Russian guns positioned along the ridges. Ahead of them stood Russian infantry and cavalry rapidly reorganizing around the artillery batteries. The deeper realization now began spreading through the surviving riders. They had not pierced the enemy line as part of a larger coordinated assault. They had charged alone into the center of an entire Russian position. Some cavalrymen tried desperately to regroup around surviving officers. Others circled wildly through the smoke, searching for familiar regimental colors that had vanished completely in the confusion. Horses without riders wandered between artillery wagons, while frightened animals reared at the sound of gunfire echoing across the valley walls. One British officer later described the battlefield as looking less like a military engagement and more like fragments of different battles colliding together at once. The terrifying discipline that had carried the brigade across the valley now began collapsing under exhaustion, confusion, and isolation. Russian forces recovered quickly from the shock of the charge. Fresh troops moved toward the battered cavalrymen from multiple directions, while artillery crews attempted to reposition damaged cannons through the smoke. The surviving British riders suddenly realized they were trapped in the center of enemy lines, with almost no chance of holding their position. Yet, even in that chaos, many continued fighting with astonishing determination, simply because retreat felt impossible. Some cavalrymen later admitted they had stopped thinking strategically altogether. Training, instinct, and survival had completely taken over. Time blurred strangely in those moments near the guns. Soldiers who survived the attack often struggled afterward to explain exactly how long they remained inside the Russian position. Some remembered only noise and smoke. Others recalled isolated details with terrifying clarity, like the sound of terrified horses screaming through the haze, or the strange silence that briefly followed individual cannon blasts before the next wave of chaos arrived. But gradually, one fact became undeniable to everyone still alive near the artillery line. The brigade could not stay there. Reinforcements were not coming. The charge had failed to break the Russian position, and now the only path out led directly back through the valley they had barely survived crossing the first time. The realization spread slowly at first, then all at once. There would be no rescue. No second wave of cavalry was coming over the ridge behind them. No infantry advance was moving to support the breakthrough. The surviving riders near the Russian guns had been left completely isolated at the far end of the valley, surrounded by smoke, enemy artillery, and confusion so overwhelming that many could barely tell which direction led back to safety. For several moments, the battlefield seemed trapped in a strange state between panic and disbelief. British cavalrymen looked around searching for officers, banners, or recognizable formations, but most of the organized structure had vanished entirely. Horses circled wildly through the haze, while artillery crews struggled to reposition cannons around the chaos erupting inside their own lines. Russian infantry began closing in from multiple directions now, their dark figures appearing and disappearing through drifting clouds of smoke. The valley that had already felt deadly during the advance suddenly became even more terrifying during the retreat, because now the surviving cavalrymen understood exactly what waited behind them. They had to cross the entire corridor again under continuous artillery fire, but this time without momentum, without formation, and without the illusion that victory might still be possible. One officer later admitted that the return ride felt less like a military withdrawal and more like escaping a collapsing nightmare. Small groups of cavalrymen began turning their horses back toward the valley, while others hesitated, uncertain whether retreat or remaining near the guns offered better odds of survival. Confusion spread rapidly as smoke covered the battlefield so completely that riders frequently became separated within seconds. Some men accidentally rode alongside enemy cavalry before realizing it through the haze. Others wandered across the valley floor, searching desperately for surviving friends or officers. The disciplined elegance associated with British cavalry had disappeared entirely now. Mud-covered uniforms, once considered symbols of prestige and order. Horses stumbled across uneven ground littered with shattered equipment and abandoned artillery gear. Men who had entered the charge with polished sabers and perfect formations now fought exhaustion, fear, and total disorientation. Yet somehow, many still maintained astonishing composure under conditions that should have completely broken them. Some cavalrymen reportedly slowed their horses long enough to help wounded comrades remount before continuing the retreat together through the smoke. Others continued searching for lost regiments, even while artillery fire echoed across the valley walls around them. It was no longer courage in the romantic sense celebrated by paintings and patriotic speeches. It was something quieter and more desperate. Survival mixed with discipline. Instinct mixed with loyalty. Human beings trying to hold on to fragments of order inside a battlefield that had become pure chaos. The farther they rode back through the valley, the more horrifying the scale of the disaster became. Riderless horses wandered through drifting smoke with torn reins dragging behind them. Cannon fire continued crashing into the open corridor while Russian cavalry pursued scattered groups attempting to escape. Some British soldiers later described seeing officers trying to rally men who could no longer even recognize which regiment they belonged to. The noise alone became overwhelming. Explosions rolled continuously across the hills, while terrified horses screamed and metal clattered against rock and shattered equipment beneath thick clouds of gunpowder smoke. And above all of it hung the growing realization that this catastrophe had unfolded in less than 20 minutes. An entire cavalry brigade, one of the proudest formations in the British Army, had nearly ceased to exist because of a misunderstood order delivered through rival commanders who never truly understood the battlefield beneath them. By the time the surviving riders finally emerged from the valley, many looked less like victorious cavalrymen and more like exhausted survivors stumbling out of some industrial nightmare the old world had never prepared them to face. When the survivors finally reached the British lines again, many officers watching from the rear could barely recognize what remained of the brigade. The attack that had begun with nearly perfect formations and polished discipline now returned in scattered fragments drifting out of smoke, one exhausted group at a time. Horses limped across the muddy ground covered in dust and foam, while riders sat in stunned silence, some still gripping sabers with trembling hands, as if their bodies had not yet realized the battle was over. Entire sections of the brigade had vanished inside the valley. Officers searched desperately for familiar faces that never returned. Trumpeters attempted to reorganize survivors into formations, but the battlefield had shattered more than cavalry lines that morning. It had shattered confidence itself. Around the British camp, reactions spread quickly between disbelief and horror. Soldiers from other units stared toward the valley, trying to understand how such a catastrophe had happened so quickly. Some infantrymen reportedly removed their hats as the survivors passed by. Others stood silent, unable to process what they had just witnessed unfold in front of them. Even experienced veterans struggled to comprehend why the cavalry had been ordered into such an exposed position without proper support. Lord Lucan himself remained furious and confused after the attack, still convinced the order had never made tactical sense from the beginning. Meanwhile, Lord Raglan continued insisting the original command had been misunderstood somewhere along the chain of communication. The blame shifted rapidly between commanders while the surviving cavalrymen sat beside their exhausted horses, trying to recover from what felt less like a battle and more like surviving a disaster nobody had intended to create. And yet, despite everything, reports of incredible bravery began spreading almost immediately through the British Army and across Europe. Newspapers seized upon the dramatic image of cavalry charging directly into enemy guns. Artists sketched scenes of mounted soldiers disappearing heroically into smoke-covered valleys. Writers transformed the attack into something almost mythological before the full reality of the disaster had even settled. Within weeks, Alfred Lord Tennyson would immortalize the event in poetry, describing the riders entering the Valley of Death with unquestioning courage. The poem spread rapidly throughout Britain and beyond, turning the brigade into legendary symbols of duty and sacrifice. But beneath the romantic language and patriotic admiration, many survivors carried a very different memory of what had actually happened inside that valley. They remembered confusion more than glory. They remembered officers arguing over unclear orders while artillery fire closed around them from every direction. They remembered smoke so thick that men became separated from lifelong comrades within seconds. Some survivors reportedly refused to discuss the charge in detail afterward because the memories felt too chaotic and surreal to explain properly. What haunted many of them was not simply the fear of battle itself. It was the realization that courage alone could no longer overcome the new realities of modern warfare. The old image of noble cavalry charges breaking enemy lines through discipline and bravery had collided headfirst with industrial firepower and battlefield confusion. The result was devastating. Military observers across Europe studied the disaster carefully in the years that followed. Some viewed it as proof that traditional cavalry tactics were becoming obsolete against modern artillery and rifles. Others focused on the catastrophic failures of communication and leadership that had transformed a battlefield maneuver into near-suicidal chaos. But for the men who survived, the lessons were far more personal. They had ridden into the valley believing discipline and courage would carry them through almost anything. Instead, they discovered that modern war could erase entire formations in minutes simply through misunderstanding, pride, and confusion. And in many ways, the valley near Balaclava became more than just a battlefield that day. It became a warning, a glimpse of the brutal industrial warfare that would soon dominate the next century, where heroism still existed, but no longer guaranteed survival against smoke, steel, and catastrophic human error. As darkness settled over the British camps near Balaclava, the excitement and noise that usually followed battle never truly arrived. Instead, an uneasy silence spread across the muddy hills overlooking the valley where the cavalry charge had collapsed only hours earlier. Campfires flickered weakly in the cold evening wind, while exhausted soldiers sat wrapped in blankets, staring toward the distant battlefield. The smoke had mostly faded now, but the memory of what happened there lingered over everyone who witnessed it. Officers walked quietly between tents, searching casualty lists for familiar names. Horses returned riderless from the valley long after sunset, wandering through camp covered in dust and foam as if still trying to find the men who had guided them into battle that morning. Some soldiers reportedly turned away because seeing those empty saddles felt harder than watching the charge itself. Throughout the night, small recovery parties cautiously moved toward the valley to search for survivors and recover equipment abandoned during the retreat. What they found deepened the sense that something larger than a failed cavalry attack had taken place there. The battlefield no longer resembled the romantic vision of warfare celebrated in paintings and military parades. It looked industrial, mechanical, and horrifyingly impersonal. Artillery had transformed an open valley into a killing zone, where discipline and courage alone had become almost meaningless against concentrated firepower and broken communication. Many soldiers who returned from the recovery efforts spoke quietly about how strange the valley felt after the battle. Torn uniforms, shattered wheels, abandoned weapons, and riderless horses lay scattered across the muddy ground beneath cold moonlight. In some places, entire sections of earth had been churned into deep black mud by cannon fire and thousands of pounding hooves. Yet the most haunting part for many survivors was the silence. Hours earlier, the valley had echoed with explosions, shouted commands, and the chaos of collapsing formations. Now, only the wind moved through the smoke drifting across the hills. Inside the British command structure, anger and blame continued spreading rapidly. Officers argued over who had misunderstood the original order and whether the disaster could have been prevented entirely. Lord Lucan blamed the vague instructions sent from Lord Raglan. Others criticized the rivalry between senior cavalry commanders that had poisoned communication from the very beginning. But no explanation fully satisfied the surviving cavalrymen themselves. Because many understood that the disaster had not come from one single mistake alone, it came from an entire military culture trapped between two eras of warfare. The commanders still believed cavalry charges could shape battlefields through discipline, speed, and prestige. But the battlefield in Crimea had revealed something terrifying instead. War was changing faster than military tradition could adapt. Artillery, rifles, smoke, distance, and confusion now dominated combat in ways that bravery alone could not overcome. The valley near Balaclava exposed this truth with brutal clarity. Some survivors carried the psychological weight of that realization for years afterward. Even as newspapers transformed the charge into legend and patriotic poetry celebrated unquestioning courage, many veterans privately remembered something much darker. They remembered how quickly order vanished once artillery began firing from every direction. They remembered how impossible it became to hear commands beneath smoke and explosions. Most of all, they remembered the helpless feeling of continuing forward even after realizing the attack no longer made sense. In later decades, military historians would study the charge as a symbol of failed leadership and battlefield miscommunication. But for the men who rode into that valley, the memory remained far more personal than any history book could fully capture. Because for a few terrifying minutes in Crimea, they experienced the moment when the old romantic image of war finally collided with the modern age and shattered. In the years after Balaclava, the charge refused to disappear. The valley itself became something larger than a battlefield. It became a symbol, repeated in newspapers, paintings, poems, military speeches, and patriotic ceremonies across Britain. School children memorized the words about honor and obedience. Artists painted endless rows of cavalry disappearing heroically into smoke beneath dark skies. To much of the public, the riders of the Light Brigade became immortal examples of courage in the face of impossible odds. But the deeper historians studied the event, the more unsettling the story became. Because behind the legend stood a far more disturbing reality. The attack had not succeeded strategically. The objectives remained unclear even afterward. Senior commanders spent years arguing over who misunderstood the order and who carried responsibility for the catastrophe. Some insisted the disaster came from a simple communication failure. Others believed pride and personal rivalry among British officers made the tragedy inevitable long before the brigade entered the valley. Even today, historians still debate the exact wording of the original order and whether the charge could have been stopped before it began. And perhaps that uncertainty is what makes the story feel so haunting more than a century later. So much death, confusion, and destruction unleashed in less than 20 minutes because no one fully understood what they were being asked to do. For the surviving cavalrymen, the psychological scars often lasted far longer than the physical wounds of battle. Many veterans rarely spoke openly about what they witnessed inside the valley. Some admitted later that they could still hear the echo of artillery rolling between the hills years afterward. Others described recurring dreams filled with drifting smoke, riderless horses, and the terrifying sensation of continuing forward after realizing something had gone horribly wrong. The charge became frozen in their memories as the exact moment when courage stopped feeling glorious and started feeling tragic. And in many ways, the valley near Balaclava marked the beginning of something much larger than a single military disaster. It exposed a terrifying truth about the modern age that armies across Europe would continue ignoring for decades. The old world still believed war could remain noble, controlled, and honorable. But industrial technology was already changing the battlefield into something colder and far less human. Artillery could erase formations before soldiers even reached the enemy line. Smoke and distance could destroy communication within minutes. Entire units could vanish because of misunderstanding, pride, and confusion before commanders fully realized what was happening. The Light Brigade simply became one of the first famous examples of this new reality, and history would only grow darker from there. Less than 60 years later, Europe would descend into the trenches of the First World War, where millions of soldiers faced machine guns, artillery barrages, poison gas, and industrial slaughter on a scale the cavalrymen of Balaclava could never have imagined. Looking back now, the valley almost feels like a warning humanity failed to understand in time. A final glimpse of the old romantic vision of warfare collapsing beneath the machinery of the modern world. Yet, perhaps the most chilling part of the entire story is this. Even after everything that happened, even after the confusion, the smoke, the failed orders, and the horrifying losses, the surviving riders still obeyed. They still advanced into the valley because discipline, loyalty, and duty had been burned into them so deeply that stopping felt impossible, even when death surrounded them from every direction. And that leaves behind a question that still lingers over the battlefield at Balaclava to this day. Was the charge truly a story of heroism? Or was it the moment modern war proved that courage alone would never again be enough to save men from the consequences of human error?